Chapter 4. Puppets. Stepping inside the toy shop had not been Noah's original intention. All he really wanted to do at first was to take a look in the window and see what was on display. He didn't have any money to buy anything, of course, but it didn't do any harm to take a look at what he couldn't afford. He also wanted to make sure that there weren't not too many customers milling around in case they realised he didn't belong there and called the village police. But somehow he felt as if he'd been sucked inside the shop without his making any decision at all, as if the whole thing had been entirely outside of his control. Of course, this was most unexpected, but he felt that now he was here, the best thing to do was simply take a look around and see what the shop was like. The first thing he noticed was how quiet it was. This was nothing like the kind of quiet he heard when he woke up in the middle of the night after a bad dream. When that happened, there was always strange, unidentifiable sounds seeping into his room from the tiny gaps around the window panes, where they weren't sealed together correctly. At those moments he could always tell that there was life outside, even if all that life was fast asleep. It was a silence that wasn't silence at all. But here, inside the shop, things were very different. Here the quiet wasn't just quiet, it was a total absence of sound. Noah had been inside a lot of toy shops in his life. Whenever his family went shopping for the day, he made a point of being on his best behaviour, because if he was good, then he knew that he would be taken to one before they went home again. And if he was very good, there was even a chance that his parents might buy him a special treat, even if he was eating them out of house and home and they had no money to spend on luxuries. So it didn't matter if his mother insisted on his trying on every pair of school trousers in the shop before choosing the first pair she'd taken off the rack 7 hours earlier. He still kept a cheerful smile on his face, as if shopping for clothes was quite the most exciting thing that an 8-year-old boy could do, and not something that made him want to scream at the top of his voice, so loudly that the walls of the shopping centre would break apart, and every shopper, salesperson, cash register, rack, shirt, tie, pants and pair of socks would disappear off into the furthest regions of the solar system and never be heard from again. But this shop was very unlike all the others he had ever visited in his life. He looked around, trying to understand what made it so different, and at first he couldn't quite put his finger on it. And then he did. The difference between this toy shop and all the other ones was that in this one there was absolutely no plastic to be seen anywhere. In fact, every toy he saw was made of wood. There were train sets laid out along the shelves, long rolling carriages and tracks that stretched from corner to corner, all made of wood. There were marching armies making their way forward to new countries and fresh adventures, and these were spread across countertops, all made of wood too. There were houses and villages, boats and trucks, every conceivable toy that an interested mind like his could dream of, and every one of them was made of a solid dark wood which seemed to give off a glow of richness and, yes, even a sort of distant hum. In fact, they didn't seem like toys at all, but like something far more important than that. Everything he saw on display was very new and different, and Noah had a sense that this might be the only shop in the world where these particular toys were sold. Almost everything was painted carefully, and not with just any old colours either, like the toys he had at home, which had surfaces that were cracked and peeled. if he so much as looked at them for too long. These were colours he'd never seen before, ones that couldn't possibly begin to name. Ones that he couldn't possibly begin to name. Here to his left was a wooden clock, and it was painted, well, not exactly green, but a colour that green might like to be if it had any imagination at all. And over there, beside the wooden pencil holder, was a wooden board game whose overriding colour was not red, but something that red might look at enviously, blushing with embarrassment at its own dull appearance. And the wooden letters said, well, there were those who might have said that they were painted yellow and blue, but they would have said this knowing that such plain words were an outrageous insult to the colouring on the letters themselves. But as curious as all this was, as surprising and unusual as all this felt to Noah's eyes, it was as nothing compared to those toys that dominated the walls of the shop in such numbers. The puppets. There were dozens of them. No, not dozens, scores. Not even scores, but hundreds, perhaps more than a person could count in one day, even with the help of one of the multicoloured wooden abacuses that were placed on a nearby countertop. They were crafted in different shapes and sizes, varying heights and widths, dissimilar colours and shapes, but every single one was made of wood and painted with bright colours that filled them with life and energy and a sense that they were fully alive. They don't look like puppets at all, thought Noah. They look too real for that. They hung in rows along the walls of the shop, wires fastened to their backs to keep them all in their places. And they weren't just puppets of people either. There were animals and vehicles and all sorts of unexpected objects, but they all had strings attached to them to allow their different parts to move. "How extraordinary," muttered Noah under his breath, and as he looked around he began to experience a curious sensation that the puppet's eyes were following him wherever he went, keeping a close watch on his every movement just in case he picked something up and broke it, or tried to run off with a toy that didn't belong to him in his back pocket. An incident just like that had happened a few months earlier when his mother had taken him on another of her unexpected days out. Something she started doing with such a sense of urgency that they should spend time together that Noah had found it all a little confusing. On that occasion, a pack of magic playing cards had mysteriously found its way into his pocket while they were walking through a shop together. But how it had happened was anyone's guess, because he certainly hadn't stolen them. In fact, he couldn't even remember having seen them on display in the first place. But just as they were leaving the shop, a rather large, rather heavy, rather sweaty man in a pale blue uniform approached them and asked in a very serious voice whether they could come with him, please. "Why?" Noah's mum had asked. "What's the problem here?" "Madam," said the security guard, using a word that made Noah wonder whether they had suddenly upped sticks and moved to France, "I have reason to believe that your little boy might be leaving the shop with an item that has not been paid for." Noah had looked up at the man with a mixture of indignation and contempt. Indignation because he was many things indeed, but he was not a thief. And contempt because there was nothing that annoyed him more than grown-ups referring to him as a little boy, particularly when he was standing right there in front of him. "Why, that's ridiculous," his mother said, shaking her head dismissively. "My son would never do such a thing." "Madam, if you could just check his back pocket," said the security guard, and sure enough, when Noah put his hand round to check, the pack of magic playing cards had somehow found its way there. "Well, I didn't steal them," insisted Noah. staring at them in surprise. The picture on the front of the box, the ace of spades, winking back at him in delight. "Then perhaps you can explain what you're doing with them," said the security guard with a sigh. "If you have questions, you can address them to me," snapped Noah's mother, glaring at the security guard, her voice rising a little now in indignation. "My son would never steal a pack of cards. We have dozens of the things at home. I'm teaching him to cheat at poker so he can make his fortune before he's 18. The guard opened his eyes wide and stared at her. He was accustomed to parents turning furiously on their children at moments like this and shaking them until their teeth fell out to get at the truth. But Noah's mother did not look like the type of woman who would do something like that. She looked like the type of mother who might actually believe her son when he answered her questions, and that was something you didn't see every day. "You didn't steal these cards, did you?" she asked, turning to him a moment later and phrasing it more as a statement than a question. "Of course not," said Noah, which was the truth, because he hadn't. "Well then," said his mother, turning back to the guard again and shrugging her shoulders, "there's nothing more to be said on the subject. An apology will do for now, but I think you should make a donation to a charity of my choice as recompense for your wrongful accusations. Something to do with animals, I think. Small, furry ones. As they're my favourite kind." "I'm afraid it's not as simple as that, madam," insisted the guard. "The fact remains that the cards were in your son's pocket, and someone must have put them there." "Ah, yes," she replied, taking them out of Noah's hand and smiling as she passed them over. "But they are magic playing cards, aren't they? They probably leapt in by themselves." This was another happy memory, the type Noah tried not to think about. But that had been a very different shop to the one he was in now. There were no security guards here, for one thing. No one to accuse him of doing anything he hadn't. He bit his lip and looked around nervously, wondering whether he should go back outside and continue on to the next village. But before he could do this, he became distracted by the sounds that were coming his way. Footsteps. Heavy, slow footsteps. He held his breath and listened carefully, narrowing his eyes as if it might allow him to hear a little better, and for a moment the footsteps seemed to stop. He breathed a sigh of relief, but before he could turn round, they started again, and he froze where he was, trying to identify exactly where they were coming from. "Beneath me," he thought, looking down, and sure enough, there was the sound of footsteps ascending from below the shop, the pounding beat of heavy boots slowly climbing a staircase, each one getting a little closer to where he stood. He looked around to see whether anyone else could hear them, but he realised that he was entirely alone. Until now, he hadn't even been aware that he was the only person in the shop, excluding the puppets, that is. "Hello," whispered Noah nervously, his voice echoing a little around him. "Hello, is anyone there?" The footsteps stopped, started, hesitated, stopped, continued, and then grew louder and louder. "Hello," he said again, raising his voice now as every nerve in his body grew more and more tense. He swallowed and wondered why he felt this curious mixture of fear and safety at the same time. This wasn't like the time he got lost in the woods overnight and his parents had come to find him before the wolves ate him. Now that was scary. And it wasn't like the afternoon he got trapped in the basement where the light didn't work because the latch had fallen on the lock. Now that was just annoying. This was something else entirely. He felt as if he was supposed to be there, but had better be ready for what came next. He turned round and glanced back towards the entrance of the shop, and this was a great surprise, he couldn't see the door anymore. He must have wandered so far in that it was no longer visible. Only he couldn't remember walking that far at all, and the shop hadn't even seemed particularly big at first. Certainly not big enough to lose yourself in. In fact, when he looked back, he couldn't see any way in or out of the shop, and no sign pointing towards the exit. All that stood behind him was hundreds and hundreds of wooden puppets, each one staring defiantly at him, smiling, laughing, frowning, threatening. Every emotion he could think of, good and bad, every sensation. Suddenly he felt as if these puppets were not his friends at all, and were moving, one by one, in his direction, surrounding him, trapping him inside an ever-decreasing circle. "Who is he anyway?" they were whispering. "A stranger. We don't like strangers. Kind of funny looking, isn't he? Short for his age. Mightn't have had his growth spurt yet. Nice hair, though." The voices grew more and more numerous, although they never rose above a whisper, and soon he couldn't make out any of the words at all, as they were all speaking at the same time and jumbling them up together into a language he didn't understand. They were closing in on him now, and he held his hands up in fright, closed his eyes, spun round and counted to 3, thinking that none of this could possibly be happening, and that when he took his hands away and opened his eyes again, he better just scream as loudly as he could, and then surely someone would come and rescue him. 1, 2, 3. "Hello," said a man's voice then, the only voice to be heard now, for the chorus of puppets had become immediately silent. "And who might you be?"